Russia is going through one of the worst periods since the beginning of the Ukraine war with the Wagner revolt. Trust in the Moscow administration, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and Kremlin officials has already decreased. A large portion of Russian citizens began to think that Moscow was starting to use its soldiers on Ukrainian soil as pawns. Therefore, riots and protest demonstrations against leader Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia increased considerably. The fact that the number of soldiers lost in the Russian army has reached unbelievable levels has become the latest situation in Russia. While international intelligence sources and Ukrainian authorities claim that the Russian army lost more than 200,000 soldiers, shocking data leaked from the Kremlin. According to documents leaked from the Kremlin, the number of troop losses from the Russian army is much higher than the figures announced by the Ukrainian authorities and international intelligence sources. Let's explore the historical details revealed by these critical documents together. According to documents leaked from the Kremlin, the loss of the Russian army in the large-scale war against Ukraine has already exceeded 300,000 people. The influential Russian telegram channel General SVR assures that in about a year and a half, the Russian Federation has lost more than 300,000 soldiers in the war against Ukraine. The General SVR alleges that the Kremlin passed data on these losses to the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, and that this data was also leaked. Russian officials claim that this information is currently unconfirmed, as the Kremlin hid the actual casualties in the war from its own people. The Ukrainian General Staff, on the other hand, publishes more modest figures. According to the Ukrainian side, the Russians have so far lost 231,030 soldiers in an all-out war. But the number of more than 300,000 troop casualties leaked from the Kremlin seems to be much closer to the real number. This information leaked from the Kremlin prepares for the end of Russian leader Vladimir Putin. These numbers could make Putin lose everything. While Putin's deception is revealed with a leak, Russian citizens and soldiers who believe in Putin are now opening their eyes to the facts because these shocking figures created a bombshell effect in Russia. At present, most of the Russian citizens and soldiers do not want to die for nothing in Ukraine and refuse to fight. Now, these record military casualties will completely alienate Russian soldiers and citizens from the war, and most Russians now seem to have completely lost faith in Putin. This leak, which came after the civil war in Russia, Lukashenko and Prigozhin's moves against Putin, and the arrest of General Surovikin as a traitor, could be referred to as Putin's worst day. Despite the heavy military losses of the Russian army, Moscow still continues the war and is willing to lose many more soldiers on some special front lines. Military expert Roman Svetin considers the Bakhmut direction to be the most important direction for which the Russian Federation will sacrifice. The Russian rejection of Kherson and even Zaporizhia orders to strengthen Bakhmut defense shows that Moscow is open to error in this regard and will increase the loss of soldiers in the Russian army. War is math. Everything is calculated. The Russians have to leave Bakhmut for Popasna or transfer troops from the Zaporizhia front and lose this front. Therefore, Russia is now in a dilemma. In this case, Russia will either withdraw its troops or lose the Zaporizhia front. For the Russians, the loss of Bakhmut is worse than the loss of the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. This is because Bakhmut is a complete information trap for Russia. Russian troops will probably abandon the Kherson and Zaporizhia directions altogether, as the task for the Russians will be to hold Bakhmut. Wagner leader Prigozhin is cited as the main reason for Russia's current plight and all these events. In other words, Prigozhin allegedly planned this trap long ago. The Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation did not make any statement on this matter. For more than a week, not a single voice has been heard, especially from the Russian ministry, about PMC Wagner's March for Justice in Moscow. But recently, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu broke his silence for the first time on July 3 about Wagner, PMC leader Yevgeny Prigozhin's armed rebellion and March for Justice, which stood 200 kilometers from Moscow. According to Sergei Shoigu, Wagner's first plans failed. Moreover, according to Shoigu, the provocation of PMC Wagner did not affect the actions of the troop groups of the Russian army, but the uprisings in Russia and the internal turmoil within the Russian army, we think, show that the Wagner rebellion, although unsuccessful, affected Putin and his regime. After the unsuccessful expedition of Prigozhin's mercenaries with the 25,000 army to Moscow, the Kremlin exiled the Wagner group to Belarus. But even now, it's claimed that there are Wagner camps in Belarus. The possible partnership between the Belarusian government and the Wagner Group poses a danger on the Ukrainian border. Any attempt by this two-part partnership could also jeopardize Putin's war strategies. Because if any action plans of Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, jointly with Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, fails, the Russian army may also lose their control over the Belarusian border. Another important factor in this regard is the possibility that the Wagner Group will initiate a rebellion process in Belarus. In both cases, Vladimir Putin cannot once again voice the possibility of opening a reinforcement front at the Belarusian border. The problems that Russia is dealing with are not just the negative effects of the failed Wagner rebellion. The Ukrainian armed forces destroyed many Russian artillery systems in line with their major offensive operations. These losses did much more damage to Russia than the Wagner rebellion. Russian air defense systems were usually placed between the second and third lines of defense or even behind the third line. This settlement scheme, planned by Moscow, failed as a result of the striking offensive operations that began with the offensive operations of the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia. Therefore, the Ukrainian army destroyed a record number of Russian air defense systems, both in the southern front lines such as Zaporizhia and Kherson and in the Donbass region, especially until the end of June. This systemic destruction of Russian air defense systems was also part of the Ukrainians' preparation for the attack. After getting past this stage, Kiev's offensive plan continued to advance. In addition to the Russian artillery systems, the Ukrainians managed to destroy a large number of special combat vehicles of the Russian army. Among the special combat vehicles lost by the Russians were infantry carrier armored vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and more critical military equipment. Since the start of the war, the Russian army has lost 3,736 tanks and 7,275 armored vehicles. This situation greatly contributed to the successful progress of the offensive plans of the Ukrainian army. The fact that the Wagner rebellion has already made so much noise is due to the military losses of the Russian army because there are many such combat vehicles in the inventory of the Wagner Group. The fact that the Russian army, which was deprived of the military equipment of the Wagner Group, faced such a rebellion normally makes Putin's troops quite tired. The Russians were already having great difficulty in terms of military resources. This is why the Wagner rebellion broke the backbone of the Russian army. While the situation on the Russian side is progressing very badly on the Ukrainian side, the general trend is the opposite. On the Ukrainian side, there are incredible innovations and advances, especially in the military sense. While the Russian army is experiencing record losses, the Ukrainian army is improving at the same rate. Much has been done to date with the advanced weapons systems that Western nations have sent to Ukraine to assist in the fight against Russia. While this equipment will undoubtedly have a huge impact on the battlefield, the reality is that the weapons supplied by the West, despite all donations, are not enough to supply the entire Ukrainian armed forces. But Kiev found the solution to this problem as well. Some newly formed Ukrainian brigades were equipped with equipment ranging from a decade to nearly half a century old. After the invasion, Ukraine was able to supplement its reserves with captured Russian T-72s and donated Western tanks. This flow of equipment allowed the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine to put on its feet a large number of motorized infantry, mechanized infantry, and tank units. Currently, 9 of Ukraine's new military units are thought to have advanced weapons systems, with the remainder operating from stockpiles drawn from strategic reserves or from old donated systems. The Ukrainians use this advantage very well on the battlefield. These tanks are also currently being used with Western tanks against the Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. While the NATO-armed Ukrainian brigades could be crucial in breaking through the Russian lines, other units would certainly see more than their fair share of the war taking advantage of such a breakthrough. The Ukrainian war is seriously locked on the Bakhmut front. There are very harsh tides, and the mutual moves of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Russian army continue. The Ukrainian armed forces were not crushed by the winter conditions and are going through the process strongly with the help of their allies. But Kiev still makes it clear that it needs help. Ukraine's Western allies do not spare their support for Ukraine in this regard. However, Turkey is one of the neighboring countries that has given the most serious support to Ukraine since the first day of the war. Neighboring Turkey, with both strategic and ammunition support, stood by Ukraine at many different points. We remember Bayraktar TB2, which made a difference at the front in the first days of the war strategically by closing its straits to Russian warships. Turkey actually gave very serious support to Ukraine in the Black Sea. In addition to the political and geopolitical support Turkey gave to Ukraine in the national arena, Turkey also provided Bayraktar TB2 armed UAVs, TRG-230 laser-guided missiles, Korkut self-propelled anti-aircraft systems, and Kirpi armored infantry vehicles. Turkish-made spy UAV surveillance systems, radar systems, and EAW systems also appeared on the Ukrainian fronts. In fact, a Turkish convoy of 42 Kirpi armored vehicles was seen entering from the Ukrainian border last week, and Ukraine has a total of 92 Kirpi armored vehicles. The latest published reports fell like a bomb on the agenda. It is reported that Turkey provided very high-level aid and supplied Ukraine with a weapon that could change the scale of the war. This weapon is artillery fire, cluster munitions. After months of Kiev pleading for ammunition from the Biden administration, Turkey began shipping as designed, artillery-fired form of cluster munitions to Ukraine in late 2022. Current and former US and European officials familiar with the decision said it is a powerful yet controversial weapon to destroy Russian tanks and kill troops on the battlefield. In November 2022, the NATO ally began shipping the first batches of the so-called dual-purpose enhanced conventional munitions made during the Cold War under a co-production agreement with the United States. The guns were designed to destroy tanks by detonating into smaller sub-ammo that could linger on the battlefield for years if they didn't explode immediately. Approximately 88 bombs are deployed in each round. The United States is prohibited by U.S. law from exporting DPICM due to its high rate of errors. The move, which Turkey has been trying to keep quiet for months, also highlights the high-wire action Ankara has played throughout the conflict, supporting Ukraine with armed Bayraktar TB2 drones, helping break Russia's advance in Kiev, and playing diplomatic mediation for the United Nations. It was a serious role. Turkey brokered a deal to export grain from the Ukrainian port of Odessa while buying Russian weapons for itself, angering NATO in the process. It was not immediately clear whether Turkish anti-surface weapons were used in combat. A source providing information on the matter and speaking on an anonymous basis said that after the U.S. denied Ukraine access to cluster munitions, the only place they could get them was Turkey. This shows that despite Turkey's rapprochement with Russia in some respects militarily, it has become a really important supporter of Ukraine. Neither the Turkish embassy in Washington nor the Ukrainian Defense Ministry made any comments on the matter. But Turkey's surrender of the DPICMs demonstrates how Ankara has played a major role in supplying Ukraine with weapons to break Russia's all-out invasion at critical moments of the war. Since Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the offensive in February 2020, Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones helped stop Russian armored convoys approaching Kiev in the early days of the war and were reported to have played a role in helping Ukraine sink the Russian cruiser Moskva, which was then the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Turkish analysts also believe that Turkey is quietly operating a drone bridge from the Korlu air base near the Bayraktar TB2 factory where the weapons are shipped to Poland and transported to Ukraine. And Turkey has walked a strict line on arms delivery. Although Turkey does not share information about the amount of cluster munitions in its stocks, Ankara-based Machinery and Chemical Industry Corporation has produced long-range artillery shells in the past that can be fired from self-destructing 155mm cannons with DPICM, submunitions, and similar projectiles under license from the United States. Another major Turkish weapons manufacturer, Roketsan, once made RQ-122 rockets, which also deployed DPICM sub-grenades for 122mm artillery systems. Slovakia, Chile, and the United States had sent cluster munitions to Turkey in the past, but the move is still kind of a reversal for Turkey after committing to the international disarmament community not to use cluster munitions. In a letter sent to the chairman of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, an international organization based in Geneva, in October 2021, and subsequently seized, Turkey insisted that it had not used, produced, imported, or transferred cluster munitions since 2005. In other words, Turkey has complied with the international conventions and stated that it has never violated these conventions. In addition to these aids, Turkey sent electronic warfare systems and sub-produced BMC Kirpi armored vehicles to Ukraine. These shipments will make a very serious contribution to the ground operations carried out by Ukraine. There are reports that electronic warfare systems from Turkey are within 70 kilometers and could cause serious damage to Russian troops on the battlefield. At the same time, the combat experience of BMC Kirpi seems high. BMC Kirpi, which showed its superior performance in bombings and its strong stance against traps, will again make a serious contribution to the Ukrainian armed forces. In April, Turkish officials also confirmed that the country would assist Ukraine after the list of requests from Kiev was published. A leaked list of these requests revealed that Ukraine requested air defense systems from Turkey, including the Korkut self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, 80,000 rounds of ammunition, and 8 TESRO medium-range surface-to-air missile systems. At the time, Turkish officials expressed their willingness to help Ukraine but said some requests were unrealistic. In addition to all these, Turkish-made TRG-230 high-precision, long-range laser-guided missiles have been transferred to Ukraine in recent days, as reported by the Current Affairs YouTube channel. All of our findings are created by the work and analysis of our field warfare expert team and are based on data from the US, UK, Russia, and Ukraine Ministries of Defense and independent war analysis and monitoring sources. So what are these Turkish-made laser-guided missile artillery systems we are talking about? TRG-230 is a laser-guided missile that can be launched from rockets on multi-caliber launcher artillery weapon systems. In addition, it can be adapted to different types of platforms that have the appropriate interface with multiple rocket launcher weapon systems. This different use option of the missile is very convenient for Ukrainians. The missile has a range of 20 to 70 kilometers and can hit targets within a range of only 2 meters. Reports indicate that the missiles have been intended for use with the Bayraktar TB2, a Turkish attack aircraft heavily used by Ukrainians throughout the conflict. TRG-230 missiles can be deployed with maximum accuracy using Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles to help locate targets at a long range. TRG-230 missiles are intended to hit the target pinpointedly rather than firing many at once. As with a normal multiple rocket launcher, Turkey, which has managed the diplomatic ties between Ukraine and Russia very well so far, plays a key role in establishing peace in the region. They did not completely break off relations with Russia. At the same time, they continued to support Ukraine permanently with many war vehicles, especially Bayraktar TB2, they supplied to Ukraine. They made the war go much better for Ukraine. At the same time, with its role in the grain corridor, Turkey took the lead in eliminating the grain crisis in the world. As you may recall, the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine took place in the meetings held in Turkey. At the same time, they indirectly ensured the security of a certain part of the Ukrainian coast by not allowing Russia's warships to pass to the Black Sea. Turkey is pushing Russia and Ukraine to start peace talks, hoping to build on recent successful diplomatic initiatives, such as the critical grain deal that allowed Ukraine to export food through a safe corridor in the war zone. Turkey maintains a delicate balance between Russia and Ukraine. Analysts say Turkey, a NATO ally, has positioned itself as a neutral player in the Ukraine war, being pro-Ukrainian without being anti-Russia. Recently, a White House spokesperson confirmed that Turkey is also the place where talks were held between CIA Chief Bill Burns and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Naryshkin. However, the spokesperson denied that peace talks are on the table. Burns reported that Russia was not conducting any negotiations. He does not discuss the resolution of the war in Ukraine. It conveys a message about the consequences of Russia's use of nuclear weapons and the risks of escalating to strategic stability. Turkey's stated neutral stance drew criticism from the West and even raised questions about Turkey's loyalty to Ankara. Turkey states that this was wrong and that Turkey is on the right track. The Turkish president managed to reach out to both Putin and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky. Erdogan is one of the very few world leaders who can do this. Turkey has a long-standing defense cooperation and trade relations with Ukraine. In the days following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February, Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones supplied to Ukraine helped hold off one of the first turning points of the war, the Russian advance. The Turkish president has urged Russia to return all occupied territory to Ukraine, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. This move clearly shows us that Turkey will play a much more active role in the war. A leopard can't change its spots. This strategy of Russian leader Vladimir Putin on Ukrainian soil caused a record number of casualties for the Moscow army. Russia lost more than 110,000 soldiers in this war. This figure means that 19% of the active Russian personnel on the operational battlefield died. But despite all this, Putin did not give up on his decision to invade Ukraine. Kiev, on the other hand, managed to announce its struggle for freedom to the whole world by pushing its limits completely. The tension in the Ukraine-Russia war increased after the first week of January. The Kiev army did not give many opportunities to the invading troops, especially after the new year with new tactics. You may remember that from the last weeks of December to the first week of 2023, Ukraine concentrated its offensive operations on Russian territory. During this time, Russia's most strategic air bases were the target of drone attacks by the Ukrainian army. You cannot teach an old dog new tricks. However, Kiev went beyond this saying and developed a completely different tactic regarding airstrikes, managing to reach even the regions of Russia far away from the Ukrainian border with reinforced unmanned aerial vehicles. This situation caused an atmosphere of stress and panic among the soldiers of the Moscow army. Russian soldiers were not safe, even within their own borders. In addition to these cross-border operations by Ukraine, which caused serious damage to the structure of the Moscow army, thousands of Russian soldiers who are now tired of this war and have come to the point of giving up due to Vladimir Putin's oppressive policies are forced to stand on the war fronts. The cracks and disagreements in the Moscow army have come to the fore, especially in recent days. Among the main reasons for this situation are the victories of the Ukrainian forces in the last days. A large part of the Russian soldiers think that this war has damaged their country and that any victory in Ukraine is not possible. For this reason, thousands of Russian soldiers either surrender to the Ukrainian army or try to escape a more dangerous fate by detonating their own ammunition. Recently, an example of this situation was experienced in the Bryansk region of Russia. At a military base in the city, drones of the Moscow army had blown up their own S-300 defense systems. Experiencing such a situation during this critical period, when the internal conflicts and belief in the war among the Russian soldiers increased the question marks in the minds. Was there a serious all-out rebellion process within the Moscow army? Because the S-300 missile systems are one of Russia's favorite defense systems. The fact that such a powerful missile system was blown up by Russian soldiers with drones that they controlled actually signaled the beginning of a rebellion. But there was not enough evidence to conclusively support this thesis. Just as this period of obscurity continued, another striking scandal emerged within the Moscow army recently near the Ukrainian city of Kupiansk. One of the Moscow army's senior tank brigade commanders deliberately blew up the T-90 tank that he was using after having an argument with Russian soldiers, causing the Russian checkpoint in the city to be burned to the ground. Yes, you heard right. This Russian commander opened fire on the command and control center where they were after an argument with the Moscow troops. The Russian commander, who rained bullets on his own soldiers from the weapons systems of the tank he used, carried out one of the biggest rebellions since the beginning of the war. Fyodor Kuvayev, one of the unmanned aerial vehicle operators of the Moscow army who witnessed the attack and fled from Russia, stated that such incidents are normal among his troops. Experiencing such situations within the Moscow army was now the most sufficient proof that a huge all-out revolt had begun. Russian soldiers no longer had patience because of this war. In addition, the troops of the Moscow army were in such a situation that they did not even hesitate to destroy their own military resources. The Moscow administration, on the other hand, gave the impression that the event should not be exaggerated too much by applying the strategy it has adopted since the beginning of the war. In fact, this internal revolt within the Moscow army had reached very dangerous dimensions. However, no official in Russia could prevent this period of collapse of the Moscow army and could not take any steps in this regard because Vladimir Putin stated that these negatives could not harm his policies. He was trying to make the citizens of Russia believe in the war more and make efforts for his cause. But the situation had reached such a critical point that now Putin's fragmented military units began to act as rivals, competing for weapons and supplies. Almost all of the military personnel in the Moscow army sought to save their own lives. Internal conflicts were no longer the concern of the Russian soldiers. Everyone was trying to get their share of the cake or looking for ways to get out of this war with the least damage. The person who made the Russian soldiers feel this way was none other than the man sitting in the seat of power. When you look at it, there is no unified command in the Russian army. There is no single headquarters, no single concept, and no unified action and command planning. For this reason, such an army is doomed to be defeated in every war it enters. Although they use ultra-powerful weapons, it is not possible to save the military units that have entered a period of structural collapse by rearranging them. This is exactly what happened in the Russian army, especially after the New Year. Russian troops were driven back into the north, northeast, and south of Ukraine. In this process, in addition to the rising voices of rebellion within Putin's army, revolts against the Moscow regime increased among the Russian local people after 400 Russian soldiers in Makiivka and 500 Russian soldiers in Stithof were killed in attacks by Ukrainian forces. Complete chaos ensued within the borders of Russia. The Moscow administration had lost nearly 2,000 soldiers in just 2 days. Vladimir Putin says that he will constantly pump troops to the front, although the last 2 months' lost data for the invading Russians are huge and devastating. They have lost around 10,000 soldiers in the last 2 weeks, and they have lost 35,000 soldiers in the last 50 days. It is very difficult to explain the situation to the public. Likewise, there is no explanation for these heavy record losses. After this, the Russian military personnel, fed up with the failures and mistakes of their commanders, were increasingly refusing to fight. Especially the confessions of the Russians mobilized to the Moscow army were quite interesting. A number of mobilized Russian soldiers claimed that they were forcibly recruited into the Moscow army, then locked up in a place like a cellar where they were tortured by dozens. These war strategies of Russia and its attitude towards its soldiers were completely inhuman and unacceptable, according to the claims of these mobilized soldiers. However, the Russian leader, trying to paint a picture of a good situation, emphasized that since the beginning of the mobilization period, his citizens joined the army voluntarily. In reality, however, things were completely different. As we mentioned, the rebellions and internal conflicts within the Russian army were increasing in direct proportion to the defeats on the battlefield. A few days ago, the Ukrainian secret services brought to light the latest example of the Russian insurgency and internal conflicts. According to a phone call released by Ukrainian intelligence, Russian soldiers were losing more on their side than on the Ukrainians at the front. In the audio recording obtained by the Ukrainian Secret Service, a Russian soldier named Alexei told his mother that the army had to send reinforcements after 20 people lost their lives in an accident at the front. According to the Russian soldier's conversation with his mother, the Moscow army's own tank operator had killed 20 of his comrades with friendly fire. In the continuation of the conversation, the Russian soldier, who explained the situations in detail to his mother, was talking about the constant occurrence of such incidents in the place where he stayed. But where Alexei is stationed has not been determined so far. The voices on the phone recording, on the other hand, were not independently verified. Such striking scandals occur in the Russian army almost every day. As Alexei pointed out, it seems that after a certain time, Ukraine will no longer need to neutralize the Russian forces because the Russians handle this with friendly fire among themselves.